we're going to head into, well, some of the topics that we already discussed, but now we put the dots together. How digitization, geopolitics, and economics impact one another is the next title of the panel. As we already mentioned this morning, digitization is not only fundamentally transforming our economy and society, but also accelerates geopolitical change. I kindly welcome on stage Jan Kallmorgen, founder and CEO of Berlin Global Advisors. Welcome. Philipp Rösler, another time, thank you very much for taking the time, former Vice Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany. And Ahita Toms, Head of International Trade Practice for Germany and Austria, and moderated by Rainer Nowak, Editor-in-Chief for Die Presse. Welcome on stage.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome. Did you guys play the whole time? No. No. Go ahead. It's a new thing. Thank you. Welcome back. And first of all, I'd like to excuse my voice. It sounds like a hangover, but I think it's a cold. I'd like to start with you. What about regulations? Do we have too many, too few?
So certainly many of our clients, customers, struggle with the layers and layers of regulation that we have in the digital space. I think you have to distinguish, of course, between regulation in some areas versus other areas, because when you talk about digital space, we talk about laws in relation to hate speech, we talk about laws in relation to processing personal data, to something like AI applications. So we cannot overgeneralize the question of whether we have over-regulation or not enough regulation, actually. And I would say thoughtful, balanced regulation is good because it also creates trust for customers, users, and in society as a whole. But when it comes to economic growth, of course, it is challenging if some regions are regulating areas, whereas other regions do not. So that is a balance that is difficult to strike for us, especially in the European Union, where we are kind of interested in more regulation than less.
So it's a European problem?
It is rather a European challenge, I would say. I don't think it's a problem, because as I said, if you have regulation, it can also create trust for the customers, because would you use an AI application where you're not sure how it is built and whether if something goes wrong, who is liable? I don't think so. Yeah,
I have a Facebook application, so maybe I'm the one.
I will not comment on that. But
please,
yeah.
Why not?
No. I think what is very important to discuss today, as Darwin Circle has brought together so many thought leaders in different disciplines, is to ensure that we discuss the future. We want economic growth. We want an environment that creates, that is helpful for innovation. At the same time, of course, we have challenges when it comes to AI and ethics. And every innovation has to be looked at in the research phase to see whether the challenges that we face can be tackled or not. Because if you don't have the discussion now, we may regret it later.
I've heard that you're quite a very shy audience. Maybe that changed over the lunch break. So if you want to raise a question, give me a sign, please, yeah?
To the lawyer, of course.
Yeah. To the lawyer, of course. Jan, you sent me an article, a very interesting article, because he's a former journalist, which I appreciate. And you said, we're welcome to the new GIT. What's GIT?
GET is short for geopolitics, ESG, environmental social governance, and technology issue, because I believe these three fields interacting areas are drivers that business leaders need to take into consideration looking into 2020, of which, of course, regulation is a big field. If you look at the field of geopolitics, for example, of course, you can think about the Middle East and exploding oil fields, but geopolitics these days is also geotech. If you look at the global competition, for example, between US and China in infrastructure, in AI, etc., but also as the weaponization of technology, restricting access to investments, the growing competition on in certain areas with Chinese local content versus the ban on Huawei, for example, in the US. So I think that's a larger definition of geopolitics. And ESG is, in my view, the paradigm change that we're going to see in the next couple of years. You see the rethinking of capitalism, purpose economy, of course, a big issue of climate change. And climate change, we see all the regulation already. And tech, well, in this conference, I don't even have to talk about tech, but tech is the underlying driver for the entire changing global economy and global society.
Thank you.
So you have to get it, is the idea.
I mean,
you have to get it,
yeah,
is the idea of GET.
Last weekend, there was a simple drone attack on Saudi Arabia, and it changed a lot in the whole system.
Yeah.
So how could that be? Just a very simple...
I think that underscores was just said, that there's a theory of, we call it geoeconomics. That means there's no political or even geopolitical development without any economic consequences, and the other way around. That means you use technology in different ways for conflicts, and even new technologies, and we discussed it even this morning, that this, in general, it's neutral new technology, but you can misuse it, sort of abuse. And that was happening with these drones, for example. And it was a minor attack with huge consequences, even economic consequences, talking about oil and oil trade. And that demonstrates that due to new technologies, the threshold for attacks will be lowered as well. And that means that we will see more often these kind of attacks or kind of conflicts, because it's way easier and you don't need that much developed and fancied, sophisticated technology to start a war or attack. You can do it even with a simple drone with huge consequences, again, for the economy, for an entire country and nation.
So, but on the other side, there would be the end of classical war.
Of course. So, and we have even seen it in different conflicts over the last 5 to 10 years, so that they changed. And if you see that every different military tries to build up sort of cybersecurity, cyber defense, even cyber attack departments, divisions, whatever, that demonstrate this is, unfortunately, trend is maybe too positive, but this is a development in geopolitics. And as a consequence, it's way easier to use these kind of instruments for an attack, because you can be quite often very anonymously and so on, rather than having, sending your troops and your tanks. So again, we will see it way more often in the future, if not even already today.
Just in local, like Ukraine or in Saudi Arabia, will it be a worldwide thing?
It's
maybe between China and the United States.
It doesn't matter, so we are all techies, and so it doesn't matter where you're sitting, right? So you can start an attack from North Korea, somewhere in Austria, in Vienna. You can do it even from around the corner, and no one knows from where it comes and who is behind this attack. And that makes it very difficult because, again, the threshold to use these instruments will be lowered, and for any country, it will be the easiest way to start any attack.
But that would mean more cybersecurity, more regulation, no?
Sure, but you have to see where we come from when it comes to cybersecurity laws. Still in 2017, 69% of our companies in the EU underestimated cybersecurity measures. 69%. This is an enormous number in 2017. So if you take that together with a research that said 1/3 of our companies in 2018 were willing to rather pay the hackers' ransom than to invest into cybersecurity measures, that just shows regulation in the cybersecurity space is needed, is important. The threat is enormous. It has massive consequences. And I would say what we have to be careful, though, is that the laws that we have, for example, in Germany, they're two layered. So you have regulation that really governs cybersecurity. But then we have sectoral regulations, and the companies are just overwhelmed how to comply with all these different laws. So we need more clear, more efficient laws, but especially in the area of cybersecurity, I would say regulation is important.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would go even further, talking about the European Union, but if you take a global view, there's a real risk of a decoupling effect between the US and China, and with Europe in between probably at the moment. And the decoupling happens on a number of fields. And militarily, we talked about this already, probably very much on the cyberspace focused. I think the old warfare in the 20th century is not over, but I think we discussed that the cyber element is much more important. But the decoupling potentially also happening on the technology space. If you look at the growing global rivalry that is very openly discussed in Washington and China, with a very clear-sighted, in that view, I would say, Washington public, that's not only the president, on China, seeing China as the global competitor. And the leverage that the Trump administration, but also the Congress, is applying on banning certain technologies, that is, I believe, a much greater problem, or could become a greater problem for, say, European or Austrian or German tech companies, because then you have to deal with 3 different sets of rules and regulation, and you potentially have to develop business models in the US that you used to be able to apply in China or sell in Europe, or you develop it in China and then apply it in the US or in Europe, that you potentially might have to develop 3 different kinds of business models that exist parallel to each other, which of course creates much more cost, it's much less efficient, etc. It's much less efficient in the way that you can build on the technologies that you invent in other parts of the world.
I was we should talk about startups as well. So is there will be any effect on startups, the trade war between China and the United States? Will startups have to take sides?
Certainly. So if you
Europe,
see
especially European,
the discussion around what we just mentioned, Huawei and the United States, and if they're not allowed anymore to use Android as an operating system or iOS, so what does it mean? They might create their operating system on their own, and then the question is, for a startup in Europe, in Austria, in Germany, Switzerland, for whom should I produce in the future my products, my software solutions, whatever? Because it's not only the technological question, because if you once will be threatened because you have delivered your software to China and therefore you are blacklisted in the US or the other way around, then you have to make a decision. You as a small startup with maybe 10, 15 people, young, highly motivated entrepreneurs, and they are then facing these kind of geopolitical challenges. They are victims of the current development. So I think this is a tangible danger, a risk. So I think we should discuss it, and we should try to avoid that this will happen, this splitting of the 2 markets, China, Shenzhen on the one hand, US, Silicon Valley on the other hand. And is there someone in between? If yes, is it Europe? And what is Europe doing then in this case?
and what would you advise?
First, I would advise that maybe they will calm down, but the learning is, as of today, we are so dependent on the US market. If you ask the startups across the world, across Europe, the vast majority is producing more for the US American market than the domestic market or anyone else. First. Now it's a second market growing, which is China, and many companies are already there engaged as well. But no one is considering if we can try to keep our competence and capabilities in our own market, in our own technology. So we are very dependent on global value chains. Because the last 10 years it worked perfectly fine. The share between production, invention, fine. But this is not the future, unfortunately. They will come back, slow down the globalization, and you have to make more things on your own. At least you should create this kind of capability. And that is something to do with a legal framework, not automatically said regulation, but I think this is a quite important issue that we realize in Europe that these nice paradise we have seen the last 10 years of global value change, that won't happen anymore in the future.
You want to disagree? No.
No, I don't disagree. I think in addition, Europe also needs to build a stronger sovereignty and a stronger IT infrastructure, if you want. If you just compare the sheer numbers, the German Chancellery announced proudly that we would spend until 2023 on a 5-year program, 500 million in R&D for artificial intelligence. The MIT spends 100 million as a private university alone, and the US defense program for research is 4 billion a year.
So, but is it just the money, or is it?
No, it's not just the money. Just saying it symbolizes the magnitude. And the new European Commission has announced new cloud initiatives, new supercomputing initiatives. I think that's all very good. I think, but also the industry leaders need to push for this. There needs to be potentially co-funding efforts, etc. Because if you don't have a sovereign own idea and own IT tech infrastructure, our dependence on either the US or China or on both will increase. And if we indeed see a decoupling, then we're sitting in the middle and will be much less potent.
So, wonderful. Please, you raise your voice or
Here's a mic.
shout out. There's a famous guy called Helmut Zilk who did a TV show like this. Please.
Thank you. My name is Karim Taga. I'm from Arthur Digital, and I'm a bit involved in this discussion on the operating system. So I think you raised a very important point around the value chain. My perspective on that is very clear. If you look at what Huawei is doing these days, after the ban and eventually the use of Android operating system, that only triggered one thing, is that they became very cautious about relying on someone else. And they just called off for a plan to create, like the iOS or the Android, a new platform called Harmony. The difference between the US and Huawei, China, is a market, obviously, and the control of their own devices. They have roughly 200 million these days. Think of what Marcus has tried to do at the time, spending 700 million. They're starting with a budget of 1.5 billion, just to support the startup company or the small company to adapt their app on Harmony in the future. So in these games, size matters. And the question is, and you raised as well, how long will Europe watch that? Don't you think that with a market of 500 million, we should also put our force together to make sure that we have also our operating system in the device? We used to have companies called Nokia and Ericsson and others producing devices. So what are we doing and what are politicians also doing to make sure that we're also part of that game on long term?
Thank you. Any other questions? So I don't have to go back again? No? Please, who wants to answer?
Now, first you have to realize, as a society, as a European Union, that the situation is as you just described, and that there are some consequences needed. I would put a bet on the table, which I did this morning as well, that so far this is not top of mind of everyone, at least in Brussels. You are based in Brussels, right? So that we should develop our own stuff first. But if you do it, then it's a question, which size? Is it really needed? Is there something already? Because sometimes we have software solutions. I have a friend, he has a software solution, which is even proved by the BSI. It's a very funny word for Bundesamt für Sicherheit in der Informationstechnologie. It's approved as in the Kaufhaus des Bundes, but no one is using it. Because if you have the choice between the German created software and the US-American well-known software, then you do what all the others are doing. You use the US-American software, and this is funny, and it would cost nothing because you have to spend it anyway to have these kind of software on your mobile phone. So it's not automatically said that you have to put a lot of money into creating a new operating system. Of course, if you really would like to create an operating system, that would cost quite a lot. But there are minor stuff where you always can counter this development by being smarter than before.
But you're absolutely right. I mean, the numbers are close to ridiculous, right? And we have to step up the efforts. The question is, when it comes to investments, if the investments are not within our own countries and in members of the European Union, will we bring in foreign investors? And that's a vicious cycle, I would say, because then we have investments in very critical infrastructure, including the tech industry, that we don't want either. And for a long time, we were very naive about who is investing in critical infrastructure in the European Union. That's why we have reformed, at least in Germany, our laws. We have a foreign investment review regime right now. We have a EU framework regulation. It comes all quite late, so no one has the solution, but I think it is our own countries who have to invest more rather than bringing in foreigners that will have insight in our critical infrastructure. About the numbers, I must say I leave that to the two of you to say what's in it actually.
Well, I think we have two elements, right, in Europe. We have the infrastructure question, where we, I think, wake up, and at least the new Commission has announced that there's several new initiatives from cloud to quantum computing. The other point is, of course, the 150-year-old question about risk aversion and lack of entrepreneurism and the lack of venture capital in Europe. I think that debate is tiring. And I think there's a new wave of entrepreneurism across Europe. I don't think there's any lack of young, bright kids that want to go to the market to become unicorns. And there's also an interesting initiatives like something that's called JEDI, standing for Joint European Disruptive Initiative, which came out of the Macron administration originally and is now a broad support. This is a public-private effort to fund moonshot projects, where you wouldn't be able to get private money for moonshot projects, meaning 10 years down the road, with a lot of venture capital pre-stage investment in R&D needed. And that is slowly, but it's getting on the way. So I think that Europe is catching up, and probably, at least we Germans always are, if we come to the game, we come late to the game, but we maybe also catch up relatively quickly. That's my hope, at least, to be in an optimistic note.
Yeah.
That's very good, optimistic. You're not so optimistic.
I'm always optimistic. I'm a liberal. You have to be optimistic in order to survive, so it's okay.
Okay, so just imagine Darwin's Circle 2025. Will there be more political risk? Will Europe be in front? What will we talk about that?
The question is, if maybe the risk level will be almost the same, but the question is, are we better prepared than as of today, or less prepared? And I would hope, and fingers crossed, that we are better prepared than as of today. That people realize, okay, something is happening. We cannot live as we lived before. Something has to change. We have to rebuild up our own industry to some extent, in software, in hardware as well. And we have some competence we can rely on. We have also the next generation, young entrepreneurs, very creative, and they are as creative, as dynamic as the guys in Silicon Valley or in Shenzhen. I think there's no difference, but they will only produce for the domestic market if there is a market. And I think this is something to do with the legal framework. And I'm not a politician anymore, so that's easy for me to say this has something to do with politics. But I would hope that this would be realized, because again, there is a topic of geoeconomics. And if they don't care about geopolitics, then the geopolitics will take care anyway about the economy. So it's a good advice to observe what happens and to act.
I'm optimistic as well. You know, we have an amazing infrastructure in the European Union. We have market power. We have the ear of so many people. We can bring together really the most important thought leaders. I think what we should try to do is to look to the future generation. So if we talk and talk now too much, and we think about all these great ethical guidelines that we can put in place and regulations, we will possibly regret it, at least for the next generations in 50 or 100 years. We may look back and say, in our region, we had all these great ideas and values, but somewhere else, innovation happened, and we had no other choice than adopting those.
In 6 years?
Yeah, agreed. I think when we look at European strength, and that's what we need to look at, and we have a view on the huge debate in the United States about reinventing capitalism, more stakeholder focus versus shareholder focus. And you talk about sustainability and climate protection. There's no other place in the world other than Europe where this has been a mantra since 150 years. I mean, don't tell an Austrian or German family-owned company what sustainability is. I mean, this is like next generation thinking, long-term thinking, etc. Obviously, Europe strives to become the climate change, the climate protection continent #1. And if you combine that with innovations in IT, I mean, in climate protection, you see tons of innovation coming up in new educational formats, etc. And Europe has the best social fabric so far to decrease the inequality, or not to let the inequality gap grow even further, let's put it this way. And I think the social democratic fabric, maybe more the northern European model than the southern European model, is becoming an attractive model worldwide. I think in the long run more attractive than an autocratic capitalism model like the Chinese, or a relatively free-fatted capitalism model like in the United States. So I think Europe, as a sustainable continent, a sustainable market, will become an interesting issue to watch.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your optimistic view. Thank you. And we are in time. It's yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Herr Kallmorgen, very on time, so you can make the flight. Thank you so much.